On the 28th of February 1855, the Congress of the United States voted to spend $7,750,000 in cash, paying off the debts of a country that had not existed for 9 years. The Republic of Texas was gone, dissolved, folded into the American Union in December of 1845. Its flag was a museum piece, its president was a United States senator, and yet here was the American Treasury, a decade later, cutting checks to men holding paper issued by a dead government. Those men were paid roughly 77 cents on the dollar. 647 parties collected on that appropriation. More than half of the entire sum went to 16 of them, 16 people, banks and estates, each taking $100,000 or more out of the United States Treasury for paper issued by a government that had ceased to exist. Much of it bought second-hand, years after the men who earned it had sold it off for whatever they could get. And here's the part that never makes it into the textbook. The men who owned that paper were not passengers in this story. They were not lucky bystanders who happened to be holding the right bonds when Washington got generous. They were in the room. This is the story of how a failed state's debt shaped the map of the United States, how the modern borders of Texas were drawn not by war, not by treaty with Mexico, but by a debt settlement, and how a lobby of bondholders in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington helped push through the most consequential political bargain of the 19th century. But I need to correct something first, because the version you've probably heard, that America annexed Texas and took on its debts, is wrong. Annexation paid the creditors nothing, not 1 cent. The men who lobbied for it spent the next 10 years discovering that. To understand why, you have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is a country that was insolvent on the day it was founded. When the Republic of Texas declared its independence from Mexico in March 1836, it had no treasury, no tax base, no banking system, and no international recognition. What it had was a war. Wars are expensive. Texas fought hers on credit. Agents were dispatched to New Orleans and to Mobile, hats in hand, borrowing from merchants and cotton factors against the only asset the Republic possessed in abundance: land it did not yet fully control. By the time the provisional and interim governments handed over to a permanent administration, the new republic had already inherited roughly $1.25 million in debt in 1836, before it had built a single road. And that would have been survivable if Texas had then spent the next decade being careful. It did not. In 1838, Mirabeau Lamar became president, and Lamar did not want a frontier settlement. He wanted an empire, a continental republic stretching to the Pacific, with a standing army, a navy, an Indian removal policy, a national bank, a public education endowment, and a brand new capital city built from nothing on the Colorado River and named after Stephen F. Austin. Every single one of those things cost money the Republic did not have. So the Republic printed it. In 1839, the Texas Treasury began issuing interest-bearing notes and then non-interest-bearing notes, printed on the reverse in red ink. Texans called them redbacks. For a few months, they circulated near face value. Then the arithmetic caught up. By 1840, the redback was collapsing on the New Orleans money market. Merchants discounted it, then refused it. And in January of 1842, the Republic of Texas effectively repudiated its own currency. Here's what that actually means. A government IOU is worth something for one reason: you can hand it back to the government to pay your taxes. That's the whole trick. Now imagine the government announces it will only take those IOUs for part of what you owe. The paper doesn't lose value gradually. It loses it that morning. That is what Texas did to its own people in 1842. What most people don't realize is what that does to a government's ability to borrow. Once you've defaulted on your own money, nobody lends to you at a sane price. And Texas kept borrowing. Under an act of the 5th of February, 1840, the Republic issued bonds at 8% interest. 8% sounds respectable. It wasn't, because those bonds were sold at such a savage discount that the government of Texas actually received, by the estimate of the economic historian Edmund Thornton Miller, somewhere around 20 cents for every dollar it promised to repay. Read that again slowly. Texas borrowed $1. Texas received 20 cents. Texas owed $1 plus 8% forever. That is not financing. That is a country being taken apart for scrap by its own lenders. And here's where it gets worse. Every dollar borrowed on those terms made the next dollar more expensive, because every new issue told the market the same thing: this government cannot pay. By 1841, Lamar's imperial ambitions produced their perfect monument. He sent an expedition to seize Santa Fe and the lucrative trade route running through it. The Texan Santa Fe expedition set out across hundreds of miles of country nobody in the party properly understood. It arrived starving, broken, and disorganized, and Mexican authorities captured the entire column without a shot being fired. The men were marched to prison in Mexico. Hold on to Santa Fe. That name comes back, and when it does, it nearly starts a civil war 9 years early. Sam Houston returned to the presidency and did the only thing that could be done. He slashed spending to the bone. The army shrank, the navy was nearly sold. Government functions simply stopped. It stabilized the debt. It could not erase it. And on the paper markets, something quiet and enormously important was happening. Republic of Texas debt began its life in the hands of the people who'd actually earned it. Soldiers paid in scrip, suppliers who'd sold flour and powder to the army, clerks paid in notes because there was no coin, New Orleans merchants who'd fronted the loans. Those people needed to eat. So through the early 1840s, they sold, at whatever the market would give them. And the market gave them almost nothing. We know roughly how little, because Texas itself would later put a number on that paper. The state's own auditors valued its 1840 Treasury bonds at 20 cents on the dollar, the redbacks 25. A soldier who had been paid $100 for a year of risking his life could sell that promise for the price of a decent dinner. But somebody was buying. And here is the detail that reframes the entire story. As the paper changed hands, it also changed address. In the late 1830s, Texas securities traded in New Orleans, close by, held locally. By the mid-1840s, trading had shifted east, to New York, then decisively to Philadelphia, and by 1850, Texas paper was quoted in Philadelphia alone. Follow the money, and it leads to one place. The debt of the Texan Revolution had migrated 1,000 miles from the men who bled for it into the ledgers of Eastern speculators who had never seen the Brazos and never intended to. They were not buying a bad investment, they were buying a bet. And the bet was simple: this republic cannot survive. When it dies, something larger absorbs it. And when a wealthy nation absorbs a bankrupt one, somebody, eventually, under enough pressure, pays the bondholders. They were betting on annexation. They were right about the annexation. They were about to be very badly wrong about the payment. In April 1844, President John Tyler signed a treaty of annexation with the Republic of Texas and sent it to the Senate. The Senate destroyed it. The vote wasn't close. It failed by better than 2-1, well short of the 2/3 a treaty requires. Northern senators would not add a slave republic the size of an empire. Anti-annexation newspapers, meanwhile, were making an accusation that would echo for a decade. They said the push for annexation was a speculator's scheme, that men in eastern cities holding worthless Texas paper and Texas land scrip were manufacturing a patriotic crusade to get their investments rescued at public expense. They were mocked for it, called conspiracy mongers. Keep that in mind for the next 15 minutes. Tyler, defeated on the treaty, went round it. Interpreting James K. Polk's election as a mandate, he pushed annexation through as a joint resolution, requiring only simple majorities in both chambers instead of 2/3 of the Senate. He signed it on the 1st of March, 1845. Now, here is the clause that nobody quotes, and it is the hinge of this entire story. The joint resolution did not have the United States assume the debt of the Republic of Texas. It explicitly declined to. Instead, Texas was to enter the Union as the only state in American history permitted to keep control of its own public lands, more than 200 million acres of unsold public domain, and Texas was to pay its own creditors out of those lands. That was the deal. That was the compromise that got wavering congressmen over the line. America takes the territory and takes the border war with Mexico, but America does not take the bill. Texas voted to accept in July 1845. It formally entered the Union on the 29th of December 1845. The bondholders in Philadelphia watched their paper jump on the news. And then they read the fine print. They had bet on a bailout. What they had actually purchased was a claim against a land sale in a state with barely 40,000 people in it, trying to sell empty acreage on a frontier at war with Mexico. Land is only worth money if somebody buys it. Texas had land the way the ocean has water. What it did not have was buyers with cash. Immigrants came, but they came broke. Land sales were disappointing from the start, and the debt sat there compounding. So the Texas legislature reached for a solution that creditors regarded as robbery. In 1848, the state told its auditor and comptroller to work out what the debt was actually worth, not its face value, but what the Republic had genuinely received when it issued the paper. They called it scaling. If Texas borrowed 20 cents and promised $1, Texas would repay 20 cents. The auditor's report of November 1851 put the face value at $9.6 million, scaled 4.8. Texas had just informed its creditors it intended to pay them roughly half. And then it got worse. By an act of the 11th of February, 1850, Texas offered to settle that scaled amount not in money, but in land, at 50 cents an acre. Imagine it from a Philadelphia broker's chair. You bought defaulted paper hoping for a federal rescue. You are being offered half your claim, paid in unsurveyed dirt, 1,000 miles away on a contested border. The creditors refused. And this is the moment the story stops being financial history and becomes political history. Because a creditor who cannot collect from a debtor has exactly one remaining option. Go over the debtor's head. Go to Washington. They organized. James Hamilton, who had once traveled Europe as the Republic's own loan commissioner, trying to raise money for Texas, now turned around and worked the other side, acting as spokesman and lobbyist for the very creditors he had helped create. He knew every bond. He knew every issue. He knew what had been promised, and by whom, and on what security. And he had one enormous piece of leverage that the creditors themselves had not created and could not have planned for. Texas was about to go to war with the United States. Remember Santa Fe. The Republic of Texas had always claimed a border running to the Rio Grande and up its length, which, drawn on a map, swallowed roughly half of present-day New Mexico, plus slices of what would become Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. After the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848 stripped Mexico of any claim north and east of the Rio Grande. A month later, the Texas legislature simply declared Santa Fe a Texas county. There was one problem. The people of Santa Fe did not want to be Texans. Many of them opposed slavery, and Texas was a slave state. Governor Peter Hansborough Bell sent an agent, Robert Neighbors, to organize the territory into functioning Texas counties. Neighbors got nowhere. When his report was made public in June 1850, Texas erupted. Newspapers demanded troops. Some voices demanded secession. Meanwhile, New Mexicans ratified a constitution for a proposed state of their own, with boundaries that included every acre Texas claimed. President Zachary Taylor, a Southerner, a slaveholder, and utterly unmoved, took the position that Texas had no right to Santa Fe and reinforced the federal garrison there. Then, on the 9th of July, 1850, Taylor died. Millard Fillmore took the oath, and on the 6th of August, Fillmore sent a message to both houses of Congress with a warning that could not be misread. If Texas militia marched into the disputed territory to enforce Texas law, they would be treated as trespassers, and he would use the army to stop them. Read the room in the summer of 1850. A slave state is preparing to send armed men against United States soldiers. Southern politicians are writing to Governor Bell offering not just sympathy but military support. California is demanding admission as a free state. The Union is coming apart 11 years ahead of schedule, and sitting in Washington, watching all of this, is a group of men holding several $1 million of worthless Republic of Texas paper. To the country, this was a constitutional crisis. To them, it was the best news in a decade, because everyone could now see the shape of the only solution. Texas would have to be paid to let go. The money that bought peace would flow into the Texas Treasury, and the creditors intended to make absolutely certain that it did not stop there. Follow the money, and it leads to one place. In January 1850, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri had already introduced a bill for Texas to cede its northern and western claims for cash. It went nowhere on its own, but the framework survived, and in the late summer of 1850, Senator James A. Pierce of Maryland drew the line that exists on your map today. East from the Rio Grande along the 32nd parallel, north to 3630, east again to the 100th meridian. That's it. That's the Panhandle. That's the shape of Texas. Not a natural border, not a conquest. A settlement figure, converted into geography. Texas surrendered its claim to some 67 million acres. In exchange, the United States would pay Texas $10 million in 5% United States bonds. But here's what they don't tell you. It's the proviso that matters. Half of that $10 million, $5 million in bonds would not be handed to Texas. Washington would hold it back, in escrow, until the creditors holding Republic of Texas securities secured by import duties filed formal releases of all claims against the United States. Sit with that. In the legislation that pulled the United States back from armed confrontation with one of its own states, in the package we teach as the Compromise of 1850, there is a clause whose sole function is to make sure a group of private bondholders gets paid before the debtor state can touch the money. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where this story usually gets told badly. The easy version says the bondholders bought the Compromise of 1850, that the whole thing was a stitch-up. The historians who have actually done the archival work don't support that. Holman Hamilton, who spent years in these records, was blunt about it. He found no absolute proof that Texas bondholders influenced the vote of a single congressman. Mark Stegmeyer, working the boundary crisis in detail, doubts the debt holders mattered much to the Boundary Act at all. And there's a structural reason why, and it's the most interesting thing in this entire story. In 1850, the debt was still held by too many people. Scattered ownership, hundreds of holders, most with small sums at stake. And a scattered interest group is a weak interest group. Everyone waits for someone else to pay for the lobbying, and nothing happens. So, in 1850, they got a clause. A good clause. But not the money. Then something changed. Over the next 6 years, ownership of that debt concentrated, bought up, consolidated, gathered into the hands of a few investors and their banking houses. Hold that. Because a small group with a large, shared, concentrated interest is the most effective political force there is. Because the Texas Boundary Bill did not pass alone, it moved as part of a package. California came in free. Utah and New Mexico were organized on popular sovereignty. The slave trade, not slavery, the trade, was abolished in the District of Columbia, and on the 18th of September, 1850, the same Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law compelling Northern citizens to assist in the capture of escaped human beings, denying the accused a jury trial and paying the adjudicating commissioner more for a ruling against the accused than for one in their favor. The Compromise of 1850 bought the Union roughly 10 more years. It also radicalized the North more thoroughly than any abolitionist speech ever had. And sitting inside that package, largely unnoticed, was a clause about who got paid, which would take another 5 years, and a very different kind of political operation to actually cash. Texas voters approved the settlement 3-1. Governor Bell signed the Act of Acceptance on the 25th of November, 1850. The crisis was over. The creditors, incredibly, still weren't paid. The proviso that was supposed to protect the bondholders now trapped them. Washington would not release $1 until the claims were filed and released. Texas and the federal government spent years arguing about what the clause actually meant. The first $5 million went out, and Texas spent it. About $1 million on claims held by Texans at or near full value. Nearly $2 million advanced to railroad construction. The rest variously appropriated. The outside creditors got nothing, again. Then Texas went further. In 1851, the legislature scaled the debt into law, and scaled it unevenly. Debt held outside Texas was written down to an average of 44% of face. Debt held by Texans was barely touched at all. Governor Bell, no friend of the outside creditors, vetoed it anyway, saying Texas could face denunciation for adopting the principle, but not for applying it unfairly. The legislature overrode him. So the creditors fought on every front they had left. They went to federal court to stop Texas granting its land to railroads, arguing that land was pledged security for their bonds. They lost. The first railroad grant went through that same year. Then, on the 11th of February, 1853, Sam Houston, by now a United States Senator and a man who had spent his political life loathing James Hamilton, stood up and denounced the settlement on the Senate floor. Congress adjourned without acting. In Philadelphia, Texas paper collapsed, and then the thing that had been quietly happening for 6 years finally paid off. The scattered creditors of 1850 were gone, bought out, consolidated. The debt now sat in a few hands, and those hands belonged to banking houses and men with real standing in the Democratic Party. In December 1854, the Senate moved. In February 1855, the House amended the bill to a straight cash settlement of 76.9 cents on the dollar, pitched to match the market value of the $5 million still sitting in escrow. The act passed at the end of that month. Texas did not want it. The governor put it to a referendum in 1855, and the voters, in tiny numbers, rejected it. So he threw out the result on the grounds of low turnout and told the legislature to pass it anyway. In February 1856, obliquely, attached to an unrelated claim, the legislature did. The Treasury began paying that summer. 647 parties collected. 16 of them took more than half of it. Were votes bought? Contemporaries were certain. Hardliners, North and South, believed congressmen had been handed Texas scrip at bargain prices, knowing exactly what a yes vote would do to its value. The Texas legislature appointed a committee to investigate bribery in its own chamber. But no one, not Hamilton, not Stegmeyer, not Summers, who went looking specifically for corruption, has ever produced the proof. And here's the uncomfortable part. They may not have needed to bribe anyone. When the benefit of a law is concentrated on a few people, and its cost is spread thinly across everyone, that law does not require corruption to pass. It only requires that the few care more than the many. That is what happened here, and it is still how it happens. The final accounting. Of that appropriation, the Treasury paid out all but $45,000, a stray remainder that sat in Washington until 1881, when it was finally handed to Texas. So what did that buy? It bought the border. Every time you look at a map of Texas, the Panhandle, that clean right-angled notch in the northwest, you are looking at the physical shape of a debt settlement. Not a battlefield, not a river, a negotiated price. It bought the permanent school fund, the land Texas kept, and the money it eventually earned went on to endow public education in the state for generations. It bought a decade. The Compromise of 1850 delayed the American Civil War by roughly 10 years and hardened the moral divide that made the war, when it came, absolute. And it brought a precedent that economists still study. When the economic historian Richard Burdekin traced Texas bond prices on the Philadelphia Exchange between 1845 and 1855, he found the price breaks lining up not with harvests or trade or war, but with legislative events. Bills moving, bills stalling, rumors of action in Washington. That is what those bonds actually were. Not investments in Texas, investments in Congress. The story we're told about Texas is a story about destiny. Frontiersmen, the Alamo, a lone star, a people who chose to be American. The story in the ledgers is different and quieter. And it goes like this. A republic borrowed money it could never repay. Its own soldiers and merchants sold that debt for pennies to men in eastern cities. Those men waited. When the Republic joined the United States, they were told plainly that Washington owed them nothing, and for 5 years that held. Then a border dispute pushed the country to the edge of war, and the price of stepping back from that edge was $10 million. And the men holding the paper made sure their names were written into the peace. The soldier who sold for pennies never knew. The speculator who took 77 cents never had to explain. That's the trade. It always is. If you want more stories where the official history and the accounting ledger tell two completely different versions of the same event, subscribe, because that gap is the only thing this channel is interested in. And tell me in the comments, was the 1855 payout a legitimate honoring of a national obligation, or the most successful lobbying operation of the 19th century? I'll read every answer.